Um, so yeah, thanks for showing up and listening to what we have to say. My name's Jacob. I am a third year here at Anschutz, and then there's a couple other med students on the call as well who are part of pre-MD. Um, who, like Spencer said, will be in the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in there, and they'll kind of be fielding those as they come in. Also, you also can just like unmute yourself and ask questions if you would like that as well. But yeah, the first session that we normally do for pre-MD is just like an overall overview of the application process. And so that's what today's session's about. And so we will just dive right in. Okay, so this is the pre-session survey with the same one on the first page. So those of you who have already filled it out, thank you. If not, it'll be in the chat so you guys can fill out still if you haven't had a chance. So this is kind of the general outline of kind of the sessions that we're hoping to have. So again, today is an overview, and then we have some topics or some sessions on the MCAT, letters rec, personal statement. And then the rest that are kind of listed for next year. So if you have signed up for the email list, then you should get like invites for these when they do happen. So jumping into the timeline for the application cycle. So generally, we recommend that you take the MCAT kind of somewhere in this time frame. Again, it's flexible, just depending on when you're applying, and if you like plan on taking any years in between. But this is generally a good time to take it just because you'll have it done and your score will be back by the time you have to submit your application, and having your MCAT score can kind of help not dictate where you apply to, but just give you a better idea of like your competitiveness in terms of where you are applying. So definitely an important thing to have. And then June is when the primary app will open. And so, or sorry, when you submit your primary app. And so this is the point where you will send kind of like the first major chunk of your application. It'll have your personal statement, all your like activity section, and that usually opens like a month before it's actually due. And so after you send your primary application, that's kind of there's like a little bit of a like a not a lag period, but there's kind of a period of time where even if you submit like your primary application on the very first day that the application opens, the AAMC will actually hold your application, and there's about a 3-week window before they even send it off to schools. And so that's kind of this little gap that you kind of see in between the primary app submission and the secondary app and judgment tests. And usually around mid-July, you'll start to hear back from the schools, and that's when they'll send the secondary apps, which are basically just like more questions that are specific to those schools that you answer, and they kind of just give the schools a little bit more information on like who you are as an applicant. And then some schools will require, they're called judgment tests. Basically, they're like tests that you take, and they're looking for like kind of what they say, like they are testing your judgment. They kind of get into like areas of like ethics and morals. And so they're not something that you can like study for or anything, but they are tests that some medical students or medical schools implement. Not all, I would say majority of them don't actually. So it's important when you are applying to medical schools just to see if they do require that, just because you will have to send that in as part of your application. And then kind of starting from August all the way to December. And on here, it kind of goes till December. But really, the interviews can stretch as far into like February and even sometimes March. Obviously, the better situation is to kind of get an interview early, just because that's kind of when the most spots are open up at the schools. But don't lose hope if it's January and you haven't heard from schools, because that process, like I said, can kind of roll into February and March. For Anschutz, I actually didn't get an interview offer until January, and I ended up here. So, like I said, it's definitely not the end of the world if you know it's September, October, and you haven't heard anything. So yeah, so this is kind of like the general layout of the session. So we're going to kind of split it into like the pre-primary, the primary application, and then the post-primary application. So jumping into the pre-primary application, this kind of includes everything that you're going to do before you submit your application. And so this will include things like shadowing, scribing, the volunteer, research that you would do during like undergrad. You know, there's a bunch of different ways to get clinical experience. You can be an EMT, you can be a CNA, or any type of position that will kind of give you like direct contact with patient care. And then also, this is also the time to do things that you're very interested in. And if possible, take leadership opportunities in. A lot of people kind of fill the leadership space with like clubs that they're in during undergrad. So just having like, you know, a couple of those activities on your application to kind of just like highlight some qualities that, you know, are looked for in a medical school applicant. Something that is a pretty big tip that like it saves you time in the long run is having a journal of what you do, just because when the time does come to submit the primary application for all of your activity sections, they're going to ask you like what activity it was, how many hours of, you know, participation did you do, when did you, like for what time period did you do it. And so it is a lot easier to kind of fill out the section if you already have that information written down somewhere. And so definitely would recommend that. And then as you're doing it as well, kind of in line with kind of like the journal comment, try to write down or figure out how you can connect this to your application. It doesn't need to be something like directly related to medicine or medical school. A lot of my activities in undergrad, actually, I wrote about things I did in like student affairs and like residential life, because that was a really big part of my undergrad. And there was a lot of different stories and different like qualities that I could pull from those stories that I think illustrated a lot of the like competencies that they're looking for. And so just it's all to say, like, you don't need to craft your pre-med experiences to be like strictly clinical. It is obviously important to have some of those, but yeah, I think like interviewers are kind of in medical schools are looking for like who you are as a person. And I think having activities that you're really passionate about, one, it becomes a lot easier to talk about. And two, when you're interviewing and you're talking to those people, it is a lot, it's really easy to kind of see when somebody's passionate about something versus when somebody did something for the sake of like checking off a box. So that's kind of just like my 2 cents on that. And then, like I kind of said, no matter what you're doing, whether it's medical, like a medical activity or just like an extracurricular that you want to document, everything you should be able to try to figure out how you can tie it into the question of like, why do you want to be a doctor? And, you know, if you're talking about a club on campus that was like handing out, you know, food to like like at a food bank or something, like that's not directly medicine, but I'm sure there are qualities or like experiences that you could pull from that you could talk about in like the kind of capacity of like how you would apply that to your to a career as a physician. All right, and then next thing is kind of like the months leading up to the application. So first thing you're going to want to do is you, again, are going to want to take the MCAT. And then you are going to, once you kind of pick an MCAT date, you know, this is going to vary depending on just like who you are as a person. But I think the best piece of advice and what I did was I picked an MCAT date and then I kind of worked my way back from there. And so I like knew that I wanted to take it at, you know, one specific time. And then I kind of worked my way back and figured out like, hey, how many months do I need to study where I feel like I could be well prepared? You know, I took a few years off between medical school, and so I was working a full-time job. And so just like taking that into consideration, like how long would that take me to study and to like keep going to work. And so, and don't be afraid to give yourself more or less time. Everyone's unique. And so I know like a lot of times you can get sucked down like the rabbit hole of like Student Doctor Network or Reddit, where people are like giving you like really intense, advice. But at the end of the day, like you need to pick a schedule that will work for your life. And then figuring out what's going to work best for you. The MCAT, much like medicine, is like there are just so many resources that you can pull from. But I think it's important that you kind of figure out like your main resources that you want to use and not get bogged down in too many resources, because then you kind of have like the problem of resource overload. And so just maybe pick like one or two study materials, whether it's like Kaplan or like the Princeton Review, things like that. And then just figuring out how you study best, and whether that's like taking the same skills that you've used in undergrad or trying to switch it up, totally ultimately what's going to work best for you. And then another big piece of advice is just practice tests are really an important part of the studying plan. And so using the practice test that you can like find online is really it's really good, because the MCAT not only is like a test of knowledge, but it's a test of like one, stamina, and two, just like learning how to take medical standardized tests. And so as you start to take more and more practice tests, you start to realize like what these question writers are like asking and how they ask the questions. And that in and of itself is like a really important skill to learn. And the next thing you're going to want to prepare is the letters of recommendation that you're going to need for applying to medical school. And so these are going to be largely dependent on the medical schools that you do apply to. Some of them will require like a committee letter. Others will require like specific letters from people in the sciences, or sometimes schools will even require people to have like a letter from like a non-science person or professor. And so just kind of being on top of that and just looking at the schools that you're interested in and kind of looking at their letter of recommendation requirements can kind of save you a lot of stress once it gets closer to submitting your application. And so big points: give your letter writer a lot of time. Oftentimes these usually are like professors or like doctors you've worked with. And so they tend to have pretty busy schedules, and it's not uncommon for them to need like a couple months to write the letter. And so I would just say err on the side of caution and ask like earlier, not so early that like they wouldn't know what to do with the letter, but early enough that you feel like you can get it done in time. A committee letter is basically some undergrad institutions, they won't have they won't have professors or doctors like submit an individual letter of recommendation, but the school themselves, usually like the life science department or like your like health science department, will kind of collect all of the letters from these professors themselves. And then that is like a letter in and of itself that can be sent to medical schools. Some medical schools require them. Even if medical schools do require them, if your undergrad institution doesn't offer that, which many don't, usually they'll give like an or option where they will just say like, or 3 letters from a professor. That's a committee letter. But yeah, kind of, I would say identify who you'd want to ask pretty early. In my opinion, it's always better to ask somebody who you've done like more like one-on-one work with, whether it's like a professor you've done research with, or a professor that you've taken multiple classes with. This is obviously going to depend on your your individual circumstances, but I went to a large public school, and so like my classes were very big, and so it was really beneficial for me to ask my letter writers from my upper division classes that were generally smaller, and a little bit easier to kind of get more on like not a personal level, but just have the professors get to know you more than just like somebody in their 300 seat lecture. And then there are some third-party sites that you can basically store your letters on. And this is like if you know you're going to take time off, or you are going to have time in between when you would ask them and when you would need it. You can use these third-party websites. Interfolio is an example of one. But if you're going to be applying like that application cycle, you also can just like give them like a link basically where they would go and they upload the letter, and then that gets directly linked to your AMCAS application. And then the next thing before the application opens is your personal statement and activities. I kind of already touched on the activities, but having a list of the things that you've done, why they're important to you, what you learned from them. And then obviously the personal statement's a really big part of the medical school application. Uh, I would say it's always better to kind of get a couple passes on the personal statement. Nothing's going to be perfect the first time you write it. Get some people to look it over, obviously, both for like grammar and things like that, but also for like the content. Ultimately, the personal statement is your way to kind of give the interviewer and the medical school a peek into who you are as a person and a better understanding of why you want to pursue a career in medicine. And so this is a really important way to do that. And so yeah, definitely send it to a few people. My advice would be to send it to people who know you well, just because when you're writing a personal statement and you send it to them, they're going to be the people who can kind of tell you like, yeah, like I think this is really reflective of who you are, and it conveys that, versus sending it to like a professor or somebody who is like a mentor but maybe might not know you that well. Those are just my 2 cents, but a personal statement is very important, and I think it's and on the flip side of that, try not to send it to too many people, just because everyone's going to have a different opinion, and you don't want to be stuck in the position where you kind of are getting conflicting views. And at the end of the day, this is your personal statement, and so advice is greatly appreciated, but I think you should always feel inclined to go with your gut and go with the story that you feel will kind of convey your interests and your passion the best. Um, yeah, this is a point I think where people can hop in if they want to give any anecdotes. But these are kind of just some points that we had on like the pre-application portion.
Yeah, I can hop in real quick, Jacob. Um, I think just on all the things that we've heard so far, I know for me it was, and I'm sure for a lot of you, this like it's very overwhelming, this whole process. And I think this first point of like taking your time and taking some years off if you need them is something that I didn't really know when I was an undergrad. And once I graduated, I was kind of like scrambling a little bit, and I had an advisor talk to me about taking some time and taking some years off. And her advice was the best advice that I received from throughout like my whole entire undergrad and like pre-med journey was to take some time, and I was able to get all the different experiences that I needed. I was able to really like build out my application, think of all of the different like activity statements that I wanted to write and like the personal statement. So having a little bit of time, like I took 3.5 years to kind of put everything together is totally doable. I mean, I started med school, I think I was 26 or 27, and we have some friends who were in their mid 30s. So there's no issue with taking a little bit of time to one, enjoy yourself, or to kind of gather all of the different experiences and the experience that you need to one, build a good application, but two, also know like this is something that I really, really want to do with my life because it's a really big investment. And having those experiences to kind of guide and educate your decision is something that I was really grateful for.
Yeah, and the only thing that I'll add is please take time off. If you saw from the timeline on that first slide, it takes like 18 months from the time you start your application to the time you'll start medical school. So if you think about that as going straight through from senior year of college, you need to really start like at the beginning of your junior year, start thinking about all of this, and that can be super overwhelming. So there is absolutely no pressure to go right through. I would say in our class, the majority of people took 1 to 3 gap years. And then the last thing I'll say about this is I'm sure all of you will read like the perfect medical school applicant has research, volunteering, leadership, 10,000 clinical hours, like 3 full-time jobs, all A's, all these things. Nobody can do that. It is like absolutely ridiculous. And you'll see people say that. The most important thing is to find the thing that you love, whether that's research, volunteering, helping the underserved populations, whatever that is, find that and make that kind of the cornerstone of your application, like what makes you you, and focus on that. Because that's way more important to show, hey, I love to do this one thing. I did it for 4 or 5 years, rather than I dipped my toe in these 9 different things just to say that I did it.
Yeah, I didn't step foot in a research lab or do any research in undergrad, and I'm still here. So can totally be whatever your application is. Cool. So now kind of moving on to the primary application process. Yeah, we kind of already talked about this. You're going to fill out your personal statement, your extracurriculars, fill out the AMCAS, which is like the application to apply to medical school, aside from like, the DO side or the Texas medical school side. And then this point on processing. So basically, like I kind of commented on earlier, there's a period in the beginning where even if you sent it on day one, it takes time to process, and the earliest they send them out is usually like 3 weeks later. But then after that point, if you do submit your application, at any given point during that cycle, depending on when you send it in, it kind of dictates when the medical schools will receive it. And so once you submit your primary application, AMCAS still has to basically like verify your application, kind of get it all together, and then send that off to the schools. And kind of, I would say end of July, kind of that July, August time period, a lot of people are sending in their applications. And so you can imagine that this process can kind of get a little overwhelming in terms of just like trying to process these. And so in those cases, like you can send your application in like July, but AMCAS or like the AAMC won't actually even be able to send that application out until like 8 weeks later, which would be 2 months. And so that's 2 months that you are you submitted your application, but a medical school is not even seeing that application. And so I think that's kind of where the general advice to kind of submit early comes in, just because the earlier you submit, the better off you are in kind of avoiding these longer processing times, which just kind of gets your application in the hands of the medical school sooner. And so the cost of applying to medical school, like everything else related to medicine, is quite expensive. There are kind of breakdowns for the primary application, secondary application. As you can see, it's $175 for the first school, and then for every additional school you submit to, it's $46. And then generally, it's going to depend on your competitiveness, how comfortable you feel, where you want to apply to. But a lot of people tend to apply, I would say on average, to at least like 15 to 20 schools, and that number can definitely get higher. And so those values start to add up very quickly, as you can imagine. And then once you submit that and you get your secondary application, those also require a fee that gets sent back to the school. And those can range anywhere from 50 to 150. And again, if you are submitting to 20 to 30 schools in addition to the primary application, this can easily get into the thousands. And so it's a very expensive process. The AAMC has a fee assistance program that you can apply for if you are somebody who would benefit, or who find themselves like having a financial burden that makes applying to medical school harder. This is something that is very, very helpful. I applied to it when I was applying to medical school, and it basically covered everything. I think ultimately there was one school that didn't waive their secondary fee. And so it was like $45 to apply to it. But if not, it would have been like in the thousands. And so the primary application gets waived because that's like through the AAMC, which is who's offering this fee assistance program. And then the secondary application, that's generally through the school itself. And so they're not like bound by the fee assistance program. But if they see that it was waived on the primary application, I would say like 90 to 95% of the schools will also waive their secondary application fee. And then interview travel, this is kind of dependent on the school itself. When me and the rest of the medical students here were applying to medical school, we were still kind of in that COVID era. And so everything was pretty much virtual. I would say a lot of schools have stayed virtual, but if any of the schools have kind of gone back to a more traditional in-person model, then you could expect to pay for like airfare, hotel, like anything where you would need to stay. So yeah, very expensive. So
Real
this
quick
is
on that,
the
Jacob.
yes.
I'm gonna put a few links in the chat of some great resources that I found about the AAMC. like fee waiving, and then some other websites that talk about the cost of medical school and the cost of applying. So I'll put those in the chat if you guys want to check them out.
And I'm a really quick note here. I wanted to apply for this, but it takes some, I don't know if you mentioned this, Jacob, but it takes some time for this part to get approved as well. And it was going to delay my application as a whole. So I had to just say like, whatever, I'm just going to have to pay for it and figure it out later. So I would make this like a really high priority to do early on to make sure you can get that approval and get that help that you need.
Yeah, Morgan brings up a great point. I think I did this in like December or January, and I was applying like the next June. So do it early. There's also like you need to get tax information, you need to like nag your parents. So like just try to get it done early if you think this is something that you would benefit from. So yeah, next thing, the timeline for this upcoming cycle, 2024 to 2025. So the MCAS will open on May 1st, which basically just means like you can get into the application itself. You can start putting stuff in, things like your activities, your personal statement once you finish it. The grades, like you have to manually enter your transcript in. And so you can imagine taking 4 years of like college courses and you have to go in like what it was, what grade you got, how many credits. And so can be a little like tedious. So just start early. And then when you can actually like press submit is the end of May. And then as you can see, the applications themselves don't even get sent until June 28th. So there's about a month's time in between. But if you submit early in that process, you're kind of going to be in that first wave of applications that get sent to medical schools, which again is just like the sooner you can get in front of a medical school, the better off. And so moving on to kind of advice on the personal statement. And so the prompt for the personal statement is a very like broad kind of vague question. It's like, why do you want to go to medical school? And you get 5,300 characters, which is not a lot. I think it's maybe like like a page or two, definitely at least 2 pages. But trying to like really convey your passion, the reason you want to go into it, like all of these into a very like concise and clear personal statement can take time. And you really have to kind of craft your story. And so start thinking about this now. Like, what is your viewpoint? What's kind of the story you want to convey? How have your activities like kind of shaped this image that you will come off as to like a medical school admissions committee? And so the first point on this, don't be afraid to get personal. I would say like the caveat to that being like, it's totally, I think, encouraged and appropriate to be personal, but like you want to still have it tie into like your reason that you want to go to medical school. It can't just be like, this like really great story about something that happened in your life, but it has like no connection to medical school. Like a lot of times it's like, did something happen in your life or like, a certain event or certain experience, and like, what did you learn from it? Or like, how did you grow from it? How did it change your perspective in your life that now makes you like, able or like passionate or wanting to go into medicine? And so I think it's kind of like a 2-part thing. Like, what is the experience, regardless of what it is, whether it's an adversity, a day that you had this like really profound experience. And then like the second part of it is like, how did it answer the question of like why you want to go to medical school? Again, like I commented on earlier, you're going to probably need several drafts of this. I think by the end of it, I'd probably done like 5 or 6 drafts. And it's not like I was like rewriting like from the very first sentence. A lot of these were just like changing paragraphs, kind of changing the emphasis of the story that I was telling. But yeah, you can kind of expect to kind of do a couple passes at it. And like I said, getting people to kind of give critiques or feedback on it. And yeah, by the end of your personal statement, somebody reading it should be like, okay, I have a good idea of who this person is, have an idea of like what's important to them. And then I also, arguably most importantly, have an idea of like why they want to go into medicine. And so that's kind of the questions that you should have in your mind when you're crafting your personal statement. So moving on to the work/activity section. talked about it a little bit earlier, but specifically, so you'll have 15 like spots to talk about activities that you're doing. Each of them will have a 700 character limit, which is not a lot. It's like it's a couple sentences. But then 3 of these activities you get to mark as like most meaningful. And then in addition to the 700, you'll get about 1,300 characters, which is like a small paragraph basically to explain like why it was most meaningful. You can do this for anything. Like it doesn't, like, I don't know. I'm of the opinion that you should use these on things that were truly meaningful to you. I think when I did it, one of my most meaningful was like medicine related, but 2 of the other things were just like clubs and like organizations that I was involved in that weren't even directly related to medicine. But they were really important to me. They had like a big impact on my life in undergrad, and they were something that I could easily write about. And like have it be authentic. And so I think while you're kind of jotting down your activity section, kind of put some thought into like what you think are the 3 most meaningful that you're going to talk about. You have up to 15 spots. You don't need to fill all 15 spots. So like don't be panicking if you're at like 13 and you're like, oh my gosh, I like ran out of things. Like if you don't have 15, you don't have 15. A couple notes is for each. So when you're doing your activity section, you will be asked to pick like what category does this fall under. So is it like employment? Is it volunteer? Is it leadership opportunity? And so for each activity, you'll kind of like notate what category you're putting it in. And you can only put 4 activities for each category. And so if you had like, if you were the president of 6 clubs, you can only put 4 of those down as like under the leadership section. And so with that in mind, it's kind of important and like it benefits you in the long run to kind of have diversity in your activities. So having a little bit of like clinical experience, having some research if that's what you're into, having some volunteer opportunities just to kind of have a more well-rounded application. And also so you're not like, you don't get to the point where you're applying to medical school and all of your activities are in one category and now you can only talk about 4 of them. And then like I kind of mentioned earlier, you'll need some information on these things. So like the dates, what the organization was. Generally these have also like a contact point. So like if you're doing these activities and they're more like one-off days, or it's something that you're going to have some time in between applying to medical school and when you did this thing, it's also important to like jot down like contact information and like whether it's an email or a phone number from the person that you could list for these activities. And then something that was not a thing when I was applying, but has since been added, was you can put anticipated experiences. And so basically, if like Spencer was commenting earlier, the process from like submitting your application to like actually getting into medical school and starting is like over a year long. And so if you are submitting your application in July, but you're going to do like a 3-month research like elective or something like that in like the fall of that year, you can put that future experience down and then you would just talk about it in the way that you would for your other experiences. But you obviously will have not done these yet. And so that's something that is also cool that again wasn't there when we were applying. And then another note on this, I think it was on a point or a slide earlier, is like, don't be afraid to put your hobbies in here. Like, I think for one of my activities, I put running as a hobby, which was something that I was very interested in undergrad that I have since like fall off. But when I was an undergrad, it was a really big hobby of mine and I talked about it. And so, yeah, don't be afraid to put other things that are not just like these like hardcore clinical or like research experiences. And so these are kind of the categories that I was talking about earlier. As you can see, there's a pretty decent amount of like categories. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can fit your experiences under certain things. Like if you were doing like volunteering as like somewhere in the medical field, you would be like community service, volunteer, medical / clinical. but then you could also probably list that under like leadership if like you held a leadership position in that. So there are ways to work around where you can kind of put something in a different category, but just kind of keep these categories in mind when you're crafting your activity section. So this will be another point that anyone, if they want to, can hop on and kind of give their anecdotes of like why you want to be a physician or how you tackled this question.
Yeah, I can add some stuff. Like we said in the chat, just really get all the words down on a paper to start with your personal statement. It's going to be hard in the beginning, but if you're just like true to yourself and really go through the experiences that informed your decision to want to be a doctor and want to go to medical school, then it's really going to come together nicely. And it's just going to take a few tries. So just be like true to yourself and honest, and don't be like, you don't need anything crazy about how like you saved someone's life or how there was like this whole big whole situation. It can really be some of the little things that are the most impactful and the most important. And then on the activity descriptions, I really liked how Jacob was talking about like tying anything that you have into why you want to be a physician, but including like some of the like weird fun things that you do other than like being a CNA or doing research. So like one of the things that I talked about was playing basketball when I was living in another country on a study abroad, and like just tying it back, like it was really, really unexpected and it was really fun, but also it kind of taught me a lot about teamwork when there was a big language barrier, and kind of like tying that into how physicians work with an interdisciplinary team. And there's a lot of like medical jargon that's used. So you can kind of twist anything that you do and anything that you have fun doing or care about into kind of why you want to be a doctor.
I have one thing here. I applied to medical school twice, and my first time I did all these essays and things on my own. I think I had my mom and my partner read over them, but I don't think they were very well written overall. Like what I was trying to say wasn't coming across like smooth or easy to read. So when I applied my second time, I found a friend who was an English literature major, and she helped me. We sat down multiple times and she just helped me make things just look a little better, sound a little better. So if you're like me and you're not someone who is well versed in like English writing or like how things are supposed to look and just really struggle to write an essay, find a friend, find someone who did that as their major who can help you. It really changed my second application.
Just to kind of add to that, I also asked people who were like, I knew would be super honest with me, because that's kind of what you need for these kind of things when you're rewriting. And it's helpful to have someone that has a background in it, but I also found it was helpful to ask the people closest to me that I knew would just be like brutally honest about like this sentence sucks, you need to rewrite it, like that kind of thing. So whoever that may be, whether it's your family, partner, my aunt was super helpful for me. So like random people, the honesty is helpful.
Cool. So next we can talk about kind of the MD PhD route. So this is an option for people who want to pursue their PhD in something while also pursuing their MD. This is like a combined program. It takes usually about 7 to 8 years to complete. Generally, it's going to depend on like, each school's practice, but a lot of schools you will go and you'll do like your clinical time. They usually will have you take your step exams, and then you leave medical school, you'll go do your PhD for 4 years, and then you come back and you finish your either last 1 or 2 years and then apply to residency like normal. And so this is just an extended training. I would definitely say that it is go into this if you're really interested in research, just because this is a very long commitment. And in addition to this, you're also still doing like residency and fellowships possibly. So you're adding 4 more years to your training, so always something to consider. And then for this, you're going to be asked 2 more questions, why you want to do MD, PhD. And then you are going to be asked like about your research experiences that you've had so far. And so this definitely is something that you need, if you want to pursue, you will have had to have had research experience already, which everyone who is doing an MD, PhD does, just because they are interested in research. And then the timeline is a little different than the like general medical school application, and that's listed here. MD, PhD, you'll also see kind of listed as MSTP, which is like medical students. MSTP. Like, I actually don't know what the abbreviation stands for. If somebody does, feel free to throw it in the chat or unmute yourself. But basically, if you see MD, PhD or MSTP, it's the same. They're talking about the same thing. And
It's
generally,
the medical scientist training program.
Thanks, Brendan. So yeah, and MD, PhD programs are usually, I think all of them are like the cost is free. So basically by doing the PhD, I think the funding comes out of like the NIH, but they basically cover the cost of your medical school attendance. So again, this is a great option, but it does require like extra time and effort.
The only thing I'll add
The next thing,
Jacob, real quick, about the MD PhD program.
Yeah.
You cannot apply to the MD programs and the MD PhD programs at the same time. So you really need to be set on the MD PhD if that's what you're going to do, because you will not have like a backup of like, oh, I'll just do the MD program. You can only do one. So just keep that in mind. You really need to love research if you want to do it.
Yeah, which, research is for some people and it's not for others. So yeah, moving on to the basically like the DO equivalent of the MCAS. And so if you're planning on applying to DO schools, the application is a little bit different. Well, there is a totally separate application. A lot of the components of it will be similar. There are some minor differences, like a difference in like the amount of characters you get for some stuff, or the types of letters of rec you need. I don't think like every school requires a DO letter of rec, but I think some of them do. And this kind of just goes back into looking at like the specific requirements, but some of them will require a letter of rec specifically from a DO physician. And so just something to consider. And there are some differences in costs, is listed here. Again, there are fee waivers available for this as well. And yeah, DO, an equally viable option for pursuing a career as a physician. There are strengths and weaknesses of MD and DO programs, and it's just a matter of like doing your research, figuring out if something is a good fit for you. If this is something you would want to pursue. And again, if you are applying to both DO and med school and MD schools, you can there's a lot of overlap, and so it's not like you're kind of doing 2 separate applications. There might just need to be some tweaking on the back end to make sure you're doing the meeting the requirements. Moving on to the other application. So Texas is special in the sense that it has their own application for applying to medical schools in Texas. Again, kind of similar structure to the AMCAS and the DO application, but there are some changes like the character limits. There are a couple more essays required, and then there's some changes with the activities that you are expected to talk about. And so there are differences. Yeah, there's just differences in the amount of characters you're allowed to have, and then some MCAT differences in terms of the cutoff. For MD programs, they tend to be around 3 years where you can use an MCAT, and with the Texas schools you get a little bit more kind of wiggle room with that. And then Texas schools are unique in the sense that it's not like MD schools where you get offered like you get an offer and then you get to accept it. They operate on like a match system, and so basically if you are going to get into a medical school in Texas, you kind of do it more of like a ranking system, and then you would get in based off like the kind of how that you know, however they crunch the numbers or not. But yeah, it's a little bit different in the sense of how you actually choose or get to, you know, select what medical school you ultimately end up going. And then there's a flat fee of $220. There's no fee waiver available, but it doesn't have all those like extra fees that the other applications have. And then these are some options for if you want to pursue like a military pathway with like your medical education. And so there's the health profession scholarship program, the specialty education loan repayment program, and the uniformed service university. So basically, these are programs that you have a basically contract or commitment with some branch of the military, and they all to some extent will like cover some costs of like your medical school education, and then in exchange they just require like a commitment to one type of like branch of the military. And so you know, a very viable option and a great way to kind of get your medical education paid for, but you know, the payoff being that you, or the kind of other side of that being that you are enrolled in a branch of the military and you are in some way like expected to complete a certain time with them. There are a decent amount of people in all the classes here at Anschutz who are a part of these. The general like big piece of advice, or like the comment that I've heard about this, is like, don't join these just for the sake of, you know, getting your tuition paid for. The comment is like, only join these if you could see yourself joining the military independent of having, you know, your medical school education covered for, because you will be in the military, you have to still do all like the basic training. There are obviously differences in like what you're expected to do, and like where your commitment lies, just because you will be in like a health profession, but you are still expected to kind of you know, have a commitment to these services. So next is moving on to the portion where like you've submitted your primary application and like what are you going to do in the meantime. And so the great thing about secondary applications is that a lot of the questions are just basically repeated year after year. And so this is, I would say, the one point where I would like recommend actually going to Student Doctor Network, because there's a giant list of all of the medical schools with their secondary questions from the previous year. And so, like I said, those usually don't change year to year. And so if you can just start writing those like before you even get them back, it'll make the process a lot easier once you do start receiving them. And again, these are questions that could range from anything. They're generally pretty short. They can be longer, especially if they're only sending you like one question. Those tend to have like longer character limits versus schools that send you 3 or 4, and those are generally kind of on, you know, more smaller paragraphs. But yeah, this can definitely get overwhelming just because, again, if you're applying to 20, 30 schools and each of them is sending you 2 to 4 secondary questions to answer, you can see how that will pile up very quickly. And there is not a hard and fast rule about when you need to send these back, but I would say like the general timeline is that I've kind of heard and that I stuck to when I was applying was trying to get these sent back within like 2 to 3 weeks from when you received them. And so again, it just serves you, you know, it'll benefit you in the long run to get kind of started on these. And there are plenty of resources that kind of explain or kind of walk you through how to write the best secondary. And just like your primary application with your personal statement, like don't be afraid to run this by somebody. You know, don't lose sleep over it and like don't spend so much time, but definitely still have somebody read it over. And then I talked about these earlier, but these like judgment tests, the Casper, snapshot, duet, and the double AMC situational. Most schools don't require these, but obviously some do. And so just look for that beforehand to make sure if you do need it, you are completing these. And then, yeah, just practicing, getting ready to conduct your interviews. Sometimes if you're still an undergrad, institutions will have like a career center. And I know at my undergrad institution, they often had like mock interview days where you would go to the career center and then they would basically conduct like a mock um, med school interview. And so that could be great practice. There is something to be said about having an interview on Zoom. If you've never done it, it can be a little different and like scary compared to an in-person interview. Overall, I think it's very similar, but just like don't have your first interview ever be on Zoom when you're applying to medical school. Like try to just like run through it with a friend or something just to get like the tech issues out of the way, figure out like the best lighting, figure out kind of how to like look so you're not awkwardly not looking at the camera or you don't seem like you're like looking other places. And so, yeah, again, similar to the secondaries, there are very common kind of interview questions that you can expect to be asked on interview day. And so this would be another place that you could look to for like resource books or student doctor network about like the general kind of questions you could be prepared to answer. And then this is kind of what I mentioned earlier, Student Doctor Network. If you just type in like the name that you're looking at, Student Doctor Network, they often will just have the secondaries listed there. Overall, I would say try to limit your time on Student Doctor Network or like Reddit. You're going to be seeing like 1,000 different pieces of advice and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. But I think this is a very beneficial thing to use. And so, yeah, this is like when you would hear me recommend this. And so here are kind of like the general questions you can expect to see on secondary applications. The cool thing is a lot of medical schools tend to ask the same questions. There are going to be unique questions from certain schools, but you can almost expect always to get like, if you offer like what kind of a diversity can you contribute to our campus, and like you can not too much would change depending on the institution that you're applying to, or like the harder or the more I guess individualized questions are like, why do you want to come to a specific school? And then you would have to do some research, figure out what specifically about that campus or institution you like. But like again, all of a lot of the secondary questions do have a lot of overlap, and so this can kind of save you time in the long run. To kind of stay organized with this, I created an Excel sheet that had all of the questions from every school that I applied to, and so when I got secondaries back, I would add them and add the questions, and then I could see kind of in that same document if other schools had asked that question already, and if I'd already finished that prompt, then I could just go to that application or that that paragraph that I'd written and just tweak it a little bit and use it again for this. So work smarter, not harder. A lot of these have overlaps, and then so timeline for secondaries, again, you will get them usually about 3 to 4 weeks after you submit your primary, depending on the processing time. Beneficial to complete them as soon as possible. Again, I would say recommended like 2 to 3 weeks. But a lot of schools will not read your application until it is like whole and complete. And so that includes getting the secondaries. And so even if you sent your primary application and you have all that squared away, like the admissions committee won't actually pick up your application until they also have received your secondaries. And so it's beneficial to get that done as well. And then for interviews, usually interview season starts early August and they go into February. Again, medical school application or like the cycle is very dynamic. People are constantly adding, dropping, denying interview requests. And so this can definitely get pushed past February. I would say that's, the further you get out from February, the less likely it is. But I've definitely heard people who have gotten off like wait lists in like May. And, it only takes one. And so, but this is kind of like the general, I would say the majority of people get their offers here. And then again, you just want to interview as soon as possible. The further and further out you get, obviously there are like less and less spots available, just because the people who interview in like August, they usually will have their offers by like a month or two later, and so those are seats that are already getting kind of taken up. And so yeah, just try to be as quick as you can with this whole process in general. And then here's another point where people can chime in if they have any kind of post-primary personal anecdotes. If not, totally cool.
The only thing that I'll say here is, like you said, most people apply to 25 schools or more. And the 2 week turnaround time can be hard for a lot of them because a lot of them will send them all out on the same day. Like I think I got 10 on the same day. So it's like, how am I supposed to do these 10 in 2 weeks? You don't have to. Of those 10 schools, pick the ones that you think you have the best chance of getting into or the most you're most interested in and focus on those. And then the ones that are more kind of like reach schools or other schools that you're not as interested in based on location, you can kind of push those beside. So just really prioritize yourself during secondary season, and that will help keep you sane rather than just spending all day every day writing.
Cool.
Yeah, I would really echo that. Also, just to answer your question real quick, Elena, I applied to 14 schools. I know that I think that that might be a little bit low for some people. I heard that a lot of people went a little bit higher than that, but you don't want to spread like super thin. Like you don't want to go too much where you really can't focus on the schools that are most important to you, or like you kind of get diluted and your application for one school like might not be as good as it could be if you didn't have 35 other schools that you're applying to. So I think like finding a sweet spot somewhere between like 10 and 25 maybe would be like the max for some of the people that I heard. But yeah, just making sure that you're like really picking schools, one, that you're actually interested in and you think you can be a good fit for, because you might see some statistics that like push you away. Like I didn't have an MCAT that was high enough for this school or that school, but I really, really feel like I like fit in with the ethos and the mission of that school. And sometimes that can be way more important. So kind of like building that list of 10 to 20, 25 schools where you really think that you're a good fit, that it's something that you would like feel at home and believe that you can be a good part of, and using that in your secondary applications. And like that's going to help with writing those applications, because say if you pick this like random school where you fit their stats. I'll give an example for me. I'm not a big like health policy person when I was applying, and I like fit the stats and I thought it was like a cool school to apply to, and I applied to George Washington in Washington, D.C. And they were really, really big on health policy and politics, and that wasn't really me. So that was a really hard secondary to write, and I didn't end up getting in there. So like kind of figuring out what schools you think you would belong at. And that's the way that I built my list.
Cool. Yeah. So I think the next thing we'll have is just like helpful resources. So this is just like very common links to things that are used during the application cycle. The first one being the application to, or like the link to the application itself for the AMCAS. The MSAR didn't talk about it throughout this presentation, but this is something that I think was very, very helpful during kind of forming my school list when I was thinking about where I wanted to apply. It's basically like a one-stop shop, and it has all of the MD schools located, and it's basically like this one online resource where you can Google the school, or not Google, you can like look up the school, and it will have information on pretty much like any aspect of the school. And so like there's like the objective stuff, like what the average MCAT was, the average GPA, science. There's like geographic data, there's demographic data, there's like breakdowns on like the people who apply, what percentage of them do research, what percentage of them do like volunteer activities. So there's just like a ton of information on most of these schools, and I thought it was very helpful just because, kind of like Brendan was saying, there is something to be said about kind of the objective of data, like knowing where you'd be more or less competitive, knowing just like information about schools in general to see if like it would be a good fit for you. Like, is it a very research heavy school, or is it a school focused on primary care? are a lot of the people there from like a certain ethnicity group? Like there's just like pretty much a bunch of data on these schools that I think could be really helpful when you're trying to craft your school selection. And so highly recommend getting it. For the kind of to comment on the fee assistance program, when you get approved for that, you also get approved for like a 1-year subscription to the MSTAR. And I also think you get the cost of your MCAT covered if you're planning on taking it like following approval of the fee assistance. It's not something that's applied retroactively though. So I took the MCAT or I enrolled for the MCAT and took it before I was approved for that, and like that cost, you just kind of have to eat it. So anything, same thing for the MSAR, I'd already purchased it. And so definitely would encourage, if you are looking at the fee assistance program, to do it early on in the application cycle. But yeah, and then like we talked about earlier, Student Doctor Network, Interfolio, a place to keep your letters of recommendation. The AAMC website as a whole, like there's just so much information and resources on like how to choose your schools, how to craft your personal statement, just like, you know, anything and everything that's kind of important to applying to medical school, you can usually find it there. And then there are tons of podcasts talking about like the medical school application cycle. And so, you know, those are there, use them. I would also say use those, I don't know, with caution. After a while, you start to hear so many like stories where people are like the perfect applicant. And if you don't have like these stories that are on these podcasts, it can be a little discouraging, but your story is just as important. Honestly, I think having a unique story as opposed to having like the stereotypical pre-med story is more advantageous, especially when people are reading hundreds of applications, thousands of applications during these cycles. Like it's the unique people who are going to stand out the most. And so I would just say, like, you know, don't be afraid to really stick to your story if it's, you know, if you feel like it represents you well. And then the last slide is just a post-session survey. This is something that we appreciate if you fill out. It just kind of helps us gauge based off your answers from the beginning to the end, just like how we can improve our session materials, and just gives us a little bit more information. So I will leave this up here, and then usually the rest of these sessions we would just open up for questions. So if any of you guys have questions that you would like to ask, either in the chat or you can just unmute yourself.